Mike Pyle, a former Biden administration Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics, is currently an economic advisor for Kamala Harris and joins us now. Mike, it's good to see you, sir.
Great to be here.
BlackRock, also worked in the Vice President's office, so you're an experienced guy to ask this first question too. There are already some laws around price gouging, particularly at the state level across this country. What would a Harris administration look to achieve that we don't already have?
Yes, I think you're right to point to those state laws. I think if you look at the principles that the vice president's thinking about when she thinks about it in an action like this, there are a few. One, this has got to be focused on the food and grocery industry. Two, this is really about emergencies. This is about very acute moments of dislocation, like after a hurricane or natural disaster. Three, going to build off of those state laws. There are 40 state laws on the books that go to price gouging in emergency situations. Red and blue states alike, that's going to be a model for her. She's also really focused on bad actors, nefarious actions. This is not price controls. There is no preset price metric or other kind of quantitative target she's looking at. It's really bad action. And lastly, she recognizes that the food industry in general is one that needs more competition, and she's going to work hard to spur small providers, both of food and groceries, to really work on that competition overall.
Let's unpack some of that piece by piece. We can get into the industry in just a moment. I want to talk about the word emergency and how you defined it. Would you define the pandemic as an emergency? And at what point did the pandemic start? And at what point did it end? Because I'm just trying to work out how this rule might be applied, how people might define things going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the type of emergency that we have in mind is much more like an acute natural disaster. I think much more like hurricane, earthquake, a very acute dislocation. Obviously, the pandemic at some level was everything for 2 or 3 years. That's very different than a very acute dislocation on the back of a natural disaster.
Do you or the vice president right now see companies that are price gouging?
So, yeah, I think, like I said, I don't really think there are emergency conditions out there. So I think it's very hard to say that this is anything that would apply in the here and now. I think she does look at the food and grocery industry writ large, sees one that in particular places has a good deal of concentration. And I think as a result is really focused on spurring competition more broadly, including, like I said, with small providers, both on the agriculture and grocery side. If we can spur more competition, spur more supply, that's going to lead to lower prices for consumers, but that's different than going after bad actors in the course of an emergency.
Speaking of competition, there's a debate within the Democratic Party, especially the donor class and the progressives, about this exact thing, competition, antitrust, and whether or not Lina Khan should still be the head of the FTC under a Harris administration. Where is Kamala Harris, the vice president, on that right now?
So where the vice president is focused over the next 78 days on unifying the Democratic Party and beating Donald Trump. That is her core focus. I think, she, alongside the president, over the last 3.5 years, has built a governing record across a whole range of issues. She's proud of that record, but right now her focus is on prosecuting the case for the next 78 days.
Let's talk about the record. You briefed her every day as her economic advisor when she was vice president before you moved to the West Wing. At one point when she was running to be president, in the primary, she was against fracking. Now she says she's not. Healthcare at one point, she's supported to eliminate private health insurance. She says she's not. Do you know which Kamala Harris we are going to get if she becomes president?
Again, I would say she has built a 3.5-year governing track record with the president. If you look at issue after issue after issue, she and the president have made choices to advance the interests of the middle class, to advance the interests of working people in this country. I'd say, look at the record she's built as vice president, sitting in office for the last 3.5 years. That's the starting point for how you should think about how the vice president would govern when she's president.
There's a question about the feasibility of some of the proposals. I'm thinking in particular about the housing market and the $25,000 subsidies for people to be able to make a down payment, as well as adding 3 million homes. A question of whether you can do that in such a way that giving money to people for down payments won't just prop up prices and lead to less affordability. How do you sort of square that circle?
Yeah, I think the most important thing that you heard the vice president talk about with respect to housing affordability is saying, we've got a crisis of building in this country. We've got to get more units built. We need to be ambitious with respect to what we're going to target in terms of eliminating that affordable housing construction gap. And we're going to work with builders and developers across the country to get units built. We're going to work with state and local governments to knock down barriers to construction to get units built. That is the center of her vision. She also recognizes that as we do that, it takes time to get traction. It takes time to get momentum. It takes time to get things built. And in the meantime, people are still suffering, are still feeling that pinch of housing affordability. And something like a buyer's credit can make a difference for households struggling to reach the middle class in the meantime while supply ramps up.
I guess that one question that people have is what we saw during the pandemic was that some of the subsidies, some of the money that was sent to people was done before some of the products were brought online, which is part of the reason why we saw the surge in inflation. How do you sort of get ahead of that type of response, given that we've seen the difficulty in building homes consistently, the red tape, et cetera? It just takes time, not to mention the lumber costs as well as getting enough people to build the homes.
Yeah, again, I mean, I think that's why it was so important that you heard the vice president putting the supply story at the beginning of the story of housing affordability. I think she's laser focused on recognizing there are barriers across this country, blue states and red states alike, to getting things built. And whether it's new initiatives to help builders and developers work alongside the federal government to get things built, whether that's working with state and local governments to punch through red tape, that's going to be her focus because she recognizes that's the key to affordability, and it's going to take time and focused energy to get that done.
Just to stay on Lisa's line of questioning, ultimately there's a duration mismatch here between how quickly you can stimulate demand and how quickly you can address supply. Will we just have to tolerate higher prices in the meantime? Is that basically what we're going to see? Isn't that the outcome of all of this?
So, I think that, these things are meant to work in parallel with one another, that supply is going to ramp up. We're going to get traction. There's going to be a lot of focus there. At the same time, there's a crisis today. Working and middle-class families need support today, and the vice president's proposed a way to do exactly that. Can
we talk about taxes?
Sure.
What's a good corporate tax rate for this country?
I think you saw the vice president embrace the Biden-Harris proposal. 28% is the proposal that the vice president supported alongside what she and the president have already proposed.
So we move up to 28. Is she in line with Biden as well on what he would have done with the taxes that are set to expire, the tax cuts that expire in 2025?
Yeah, I think that if you look at the Biden-Harris budget, you see a range of tax proposals, you see a range of investments, you see a range of principles around how the TCJA expiration should be handled, and that's something that, as a governing partner to the president, the vice president has embraced.
Is the deficit an ongoing concern for you and the team?
I mean, I think you heard from the vice president herself on Friday when she gave her speech. She pointed to the fact that when you look at the Trump campaign playbook, it's extending and deepening tax cuts for corporations and the wealthiest. It is not fully offsetting those with a set of sales taxes on imported goods that will hurt working families. And as a result, that's going to increase and blow up the deficit. On the flip side, if you look at the Biden-Harris budget, there is net deficit reduction alongside the investments in the middle class. And she, continues to believe that deficit reduction needs to be an important part of the pitch.
We've run out of time and we've only scratched the surface. Do you think that the vice president would sit down with Bloomberg TV and actually have a conversation about the economy? Because we'd like to make that happen.
I think that the vice president looks to go meet voters wherever she can meet them. And there's a lot of constraints on her time over the next 78 days, but she wants to go where the voters are.